At Eling Tide Mill, wheat is ground down to produce flour. Having passed through the millstones, the flour travels down a chute and is collected in a sack on the ground floor of the mill. This is 100% wholemeal flour, as nothing has been added or removed. As the flour comes down, the miller can sieve the flour to test the size of the bran. The bran is the outer casing of the wheat that's sliced off by the millstones above. The benefit to sieving out some of this bran is that it allows the miller to assess the way the mill is working. Ideally, the bran should be large and chunky. It shouldn't be crushed, it should be ripped instead. If you make the flour too fine, this bran becomes too small, which can make it difficult to bake with, which is why we aim for larger, flakier bran. Once milling is completed, you're left with wholemeal flour. But there are further ways to refine the flour in order to create different types of flour. The way Eling changes wholemeal flour into brown flour is to use a flour dresser. The flour dresser is an inclined sieve with a series of rotating brushes inside to help to remove bran from the flour. This machine is powered by the water wheel by engaging the auxiliary drive. The miller will pour flour from the bin loft and through the sieve. The flour is collected in a sack when it comes out on the ground floor. There are 3 chutes on the ground floor. The lightest material will travel down the first chute, and this will be the finest flour. There will still be bran in this flour, but less of it. The second chute carries flour that has a higher concentration of bran in it. The third and final chute should carry entirely bran. This is how Eling Tide Mill produces flour. This short film has been created to try and give viewers a visual explanation of how Eling Tide Mill works. The mill is built on the tidal side of a causeway, which is located on the upper reach of Southampton Water. This is effectively a dam that traps the rising seawater in a mill pond. Built into this causeway are a set of one-way gates, called sea gates, which allow the tide to flow into the mill pond. The sea gates have a hinged section in the middle of the gate that's pushed open by the incoming tide. While the mill pond is filling up, the mill is unable to function. Instead, the miller must wait for the tide to drop. The mill pond will remain full though, because the sea gates have trapped the water. As the tide drops, the water wheel is slowly uncovered, and once the tide has dropped low enough, we're able to get things turning. Sacks of grain are stored in the bin loft, ready to be milled into flour. Originally, Eling would have milled a variety of grains, for instance rye and spelt. However, now Eling only produces flour from wheat. Each sack can weigh between 20 to 30 kilograms, and they're transported around the building using a sack truck. To get the sacks to all the different floors, the miller can use the sack hoist. Watch our sack hoist video to see more. The miller will then pour the sacks of grain into a storage bin. A stopper holds the grain in the chute. When the stopper is released, the grain begins to fill the hopper sat above the millstones. Back on the ground floor is the flour delivery chute, where a sack is placed. As the grain passes through the millstones, it will travel down the chute and into this sack as flour. To get the machinery started, the miller must lift the sluice gate. This is the gate that's been holding the water in the mill pond, ready to power the mill. The water turns a wheel that goes on to power all of the mill machinery. The starting point is the water wheel. This turns the pit wheel. This goes on to turn the wallower. Then the great spur wheel, which finally turns the stone nut. Once the stone nut begins to turn, the millstones begin to rotate, ready to produce flour. Back on the first floor, the grain that has filled the hopper above the stones gradually pours out of the wooden hopper and into the iron shoe. From here, the damsel knocks against the iron shoe, encouraging the grain to fall into the stones to be ground into flour. As the grain empties from the iron shoe, more grain will fall from the hopper to fill the space, matching the speed that the mill is working at. This means that there is a constant flow of grain for the mill to work with. There are 2 stones, one stone on the bottom that does not move, called the bed stone, and a stone above, the runner stone, that is powered by the moving machinery. The grain falls into the middle of the runner stone and is pushed to the outside as it's ground down into flour. Watch our videos on millstones to find out more. On a good day, this process should yield around 60 kilograms an hour. Whilst milling, there are a few controls that can control the grade or fineness of the flour that the mill produces. The first control that the miller can use is the sluice gate. This can either be opened or closed to control the power of the mill. This has an immediate effect on the running speed of the machinery. The second way that the miller can control the grade of the flour is to change the distance between the stones. This is known as tentering the stones up or down, and is controlled by the hand wheel. The closer together the stones are, the finer the grade of flour. The further apart they are, the coarser. However, the closer the stones are, the slower the machinery will run because of increased friction. The third and final way that the grade of the flour can be controlled is using the thumb screw to control the angle of the shoe. This allows more or less grain to be passed through to the stones, but again affects the speed at which the mill grinds the grain into flour, because more grain is giving the stones more work to do, increasing the friction and reducing the speed. The slower the mill grinds the flour, the finer the grade of the flour, which also alters the bran. From here, the miller can weigh the flour using the scales in the mill, and this information, as well as the date that the flour was milled, is recorded. The flour is now ready to be placed into smaller bags and ready to sell, and this is how flour is produced at Eling Tide Mill. Eling Tide Mill has 4 floors. The bin loft, located at the very top of the building, holds all of the raw materials for milling. The first floor, which has the millstones, we call the stone floor. The ground floor, where you're watching this film, is called the Hurst floor. And our basement level is called the undercroft. The water wheel is located in the undercroft of the mill. As the miller opens the sluice gate, water leaves the mill pond, which pushes the water wheel and rotates the machinery. A tall vertical shaft runs through the centre of the mill, and from this shaft, power can be transferred to different parts of the building through different wheels. When the water wheel rotates, the pit wheel, sharing the same axle, rotates at the same speed. There are 108 bevel teeth on the rim of the pit wheel, which mesh with 50 on the wallower. This transfers the power vertically so it can be used on different floors. The wallower turns the main vertical shaft on which are mounted the great spur wheel and the crown wheel. There are 107 teeth on the spur wheel, and this meshes with the stone nut, which turns the millstone above. The stone nut has only 23 teeth, which increases the speed still further. The number of teeth, cogs, is deliberately irregular to ensure that the same teeth do not mesh together every rotation. The great spur wheel and the stone nut are both made of cast iron, but the great spur wheel has teeth made from wood. These are designed to act like an electric fuse in the case of an emergency and break if needed. This is because it's cheaper to replace broken teeth than to replace the entire cast wheel. The millstone is attached to the stone nut, so the runner stone spins at the same speed. When it spins, it grinds the grain to produce flour. At the top of the vertical shaft is a final wheel, called the crown wheel. This is the wheel that transfers power to the auxiliary machinery. The sack hoist is used to help take the heavy bags from the bottom to the top of the mill, and the flour dresser is used to remove a percentage of the bran, producing a more refined flour that we call brown flour. You can learn more about the flour dresser on our flour dresser video. Millers are not just here to produce flour though. They're also responsible for ensuring that the machinery and building are safe. They do this with daily checks and maintenance works. Periodically, the miller will also have to check on the wooden teeth to ensure that they are still strong enough to keep meshing with the iron wheels in the building. All the moving parts also need to be maintained with oils and greases to ensure that they turn smoothly. When the tide allows, the miller can get into the undercroft of the mill to check that everything is functioning correctly with the water wheel and the other parts of the machinery that are below floor level. Whilst down in the undercroft, the miller can check on the bolts that hold the paddle blades onto the water wheel, and that all of the wedges are secure and in place. Also in the undercroft, the miller can check that everything is properly lubricated, and if required, can add more grease. These are some of the ways we maintain the machinery at Eling Tide Mill. In order to produce flour, the mill needs some raw materials. Originally, Eling would have milled a variety of grains, for instance rye and spelt, but now we only mill wheat. We now receive our deliveries by van, but in the past we could have had them delivered by train, by barge, or even horse and cart. As the mill is spread out over 3 floors, and the wheat deliveries are taken on the ground floor, there needs to be a system in place to get the wheat to the bin loft at the top of the building. However, each sack can weigh between 20 to 30 kilograms, so it's not efficient for the miller to take these into the bin loft manually, and so the sack hoist is used to make the process safer and easier. The sack hoist is a system of wheels, chains and pulleys that we use to raise sacks up to the top of the building. Historically, this process would have been powered by the tides using the water wheel. In recent years, an electric hoist system has been installed as well, giving Eling the ability to lift the sacks even if the tide is in. When a sack needs to be lifted, it's placed at the bottom of the sack hoist system. A chain is looped around the top of the sack. Then, when the machinery is engaged, it's lifted through a series of trapdoors through the mill. These trapdoors open only one way. This means that the sacks cannot go backwards or fall through the trapdoors. In the bin loft, the sack hoist has an automatic cut-off system that takes the mechanism out of drive. The sack, when raised high enough, will pull a metal bar which disengages the mechanism, meaning that the sack of wheat stops moving upwards. This is helpful because if the miller was not around to stop things, the sack would hit the roof and the grain would spill everywhere. Once the sack has been taken off the chain is lowered back through the trapdoors ready to begin the process all over again. Once the sack of grain is on the top floor, it's ready to be placed into a storage unit ready for future use. This is how we move grain around the building at Eling Tide Mill. The millstones are the heart of the mill, and are the pieces that actually carry out the grinding process to turn grain into flour. At Eling, we use one pair of millstones that sit above one another in the ton cover on the first floor. The bottom stone, called the bedstone, remains stationary at all times, whilst the stone above that, the runner stone, rotates. These stones can also be moved closer together or further apart to affect the fineness or grade of the flour. Eling's millstones are powered by the tide and a series of interconnected turning wheels. Before mills became mechanised, this process would have been a long and laborious one carried out by human or animal power. This process hasn't changed a great deal for thousands of years. There would be a stone on which grain would be spread, then someone would need to grind it manually using a hard object. Check out our hand querns in the visitor centre. Hand milling is very labour intensive and not a very efficient way of producing flour. The way that millstones work in a mechanised mill is much more sophisticated, as they involve gearing to increase the speed of rotation. Also, millstones aren't simply flat surfaces, but have grooves in them to help with the milling process. These grooves are arranged in a pattern known as a harp, and as the millstones turn, it's these harps that help to push the grain to the outside of the stones. As the grain is pushed to the outside edge of the stones, it's ground down, turning what was grain into flour. The harps also have another important function. They help to keep the stones cool by drawing cool air towards the centre. By allowing air to enter the stones, they don't get too hot, meaning the quality of the flour isn't compromised. It also limits the risk of fire. On the outside of the runner stone are sweeps. Once the flour has reached the edge of the stones, sweeps push the flour down the flour chute. As with the other machinery in the mill, the miller must also make sure that the stones are in the right condition to mill. If they aren't running correctly, then it has an immediate effect on the produced flour. Any work on the stones involves removing the ton cover and then using the stone crane to lift the runner stone. Once they are apart, the miller can check that the grooves in the stone are pronounced enough to function. Over time, these grooves get worn down, becoming blunt, which means that the bran is not being sliced from the wheat but is crushed instead. This affects the quality of the flour. To rectify this, the miller will have to use a special tool called a mill bill to redefine the grooves and sharpen them up. This process is called stone dressing. As well as using the mill bill, the miller will also use a proving staff to make sure that there are no high spots on the stone. We don't want there to be any high spots on the millstones because this can make them imbalanced, and this will cause uneven wear across the stone, meaning that there will be more work for the miller next time he has to dress the stones. This is how we look after the stones at Eling Tide Mill. The Grade 2-star listed Eling Tide Mill is one of only a handful of working tide mills left in the country and offers its visitors access to its history and machinery. Having previously been restored in the 70s, the mill has undergone further restoration and development to give visitors greater visual access and understanding. Between 2015 and 2018, Eling Tide Mill experience underwent major changes. A grant of £1.7 million from the Heritage Lottery Fund, together with support from New Forest District Council and Totton and Eling Town Council, funded work to the mill and visitor centre. Aside from these two key areas, the project also set out to improve local access to the site and surrounding areas, which are important natural heritage areas. The main change in the mill was to remove some of the physical barriers around the machinery, replacing with glass, so it's much easier for visitors to see it in action. Before the most recent renovation, access to the machinery was limited. Now, however, visitors have much better views, allowing deeper understanding of how the mill and its machinery work. In the visitor centre, an extension was built for the mill cafe, an ideal spot for morning coffee, a light lunch or afternoon cake. Visitors can explore the discovery room, learning all about the mill and its history from our displays, and get hands-on with our quernstones or the working model of a tide mill. The addition of the John Chandler activity room gives an ideal multi-purpose area for our regular activities programme, as well as a space for school and other group visits. It even acts as an overflow for our popular mill cafe. Although the jewel in our crown, the Eling Tide Mill experience extends beyond the mill and visitor centre and also includes improvements to outside spaces in the surrounding area, principally our mill pond, Goatee Beach and Bartley Water. At Goatee Beach and around the mill pond, we improved the paths, added new stretches of boardwalk and removed gates so wheelchair users and families with pushchairs can enjoy these walks. We also added some opportunities for people to find out about the wildlife and plant life in the areas with our outdoor information panels. Goatee Beach, a stretch of Southampton Water shoreline, is a haven for birdlife. Looking out over the mudflats of Eling and Bury Marshes, the view is a site of special scientific interest thanks to the birds who come to spend winter here. Goatee Beach isn't only a site of scientific interest, but also one of historical interest as well. Above Goatee Beach is Eling's Church, St Mary's, another Grade 2-star listed building. The outside is mainly Victorian, but inside there are remains of the original Saxon structure. If you're watching this DVD, you'll have no doubt visited the Eling Tide Mill experience, so we hope you enjoyed your visit and look forward to welcoming you again.